Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our double podcast episode about the Trinidad General Strike of 1937. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, I'd go back and listen to that first.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
Before we get started, just a reminder that our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive early access to podcast episodes without ads, bonus episodes, free and discounted merch, and other content. Join us and find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. Where we left off last time, Ryan Jobson had told us about several years of agitation in Trinidad by employed and unemployed workers and landless peasants. Over this time, strikes and protests escalated, many of them by supporters of Uriah Butler, a disabled former oil worker and union leader who also advocated the end of direct British colonial rule over the country. And eventually, Butler decided to step up the struggle to another level.
In June of 1937, there's a dispatch from Butler that begins to circulate around the region calling for a general strike on Tuesday, June 22nd. So that was the plan for Butler. But, these workers are really sort of ready and primed for the strike action. So we actually see the strike begin ahead of schedule, so to speak, on Saturday, June 19th, 1937. So first it begins spontaneously on leaseholders' Forest Reserve oil field. So the sort of graveyard shift workers walk out around 7 a.m. and they meet the morning shift workers at the sort of the proverbial gates of the estate. And they also instruct them to follow them in walking off the job. So from Forest Reserve, they march to Faizabad Junction, which is the nearby town. And they're also joined by workers from neighboring oil fields. And, there's bustling Saturday traffic. This is often sort of payday for the workers. So there are large sort of gatherings in public around rum shops and storefronts.
From there, the strike began to grow.
By the following afternoon, the remaining employees at Forest Reserve, as well as several other oil fields, La Brea, Parrylands, also left the estates. And then, again, they gathered at rum shops, and this crowd of nearly sort of 500 men and women gather in front of the yard of a local proprietor. And Butler joins them and gives this sort of impassioned address in his typical revival fashion. Here they clash with police. They march through the crowd and attempt to arrest Butler. And they're trying to read the warrant, but being drowned out by all of these workers who are shouting and pelting the policemen with stones and bottles. And two of the inspectors sort of retreat, and they leave one infamous inspector, Charlie King, alone in this melee. So he tries to go alone and take Butler into custody, but he's pushed back by the workers, and he runs into a nearby shop where he attempts to hide, but he's actually followed by a group of women who were supporters of Butler. And I should add, and I can talk about later, the fact that women comprised a very substantial base of the Butlerite movement. And they actually, they beat Charlie King, they corner him and expel him from a second floor window. And then he's soaked in gasoline and set on fire. So Charlie King is this sort of infamous figure in calypsos of the time, in almost sort of Trinidad folk culture. They call that junction in Faizabad Charlie King Junction to this day. So that's where Charlie King sort of suffered the fate of the workers' ire. And I should say that, as the workers sort of disbanded that evening, they also saw smoke billowing from the Apex oil fields, right? Because workers began to set fire to pump jacks and engage in industrial sabotage. Just to round out sort of this story of the strike, it continues on Monday morning. The refinery workers just sort of a few miles north in Pointe-à-Pierre, as well as sugar estate workers joined the strike. And also the unemployed continue to participate in all of these sort of processions and marches that happen kind of spontaneously as workers leave both the refinery and the oil field estates. So they're looting goods and shops along their procession. They're singing, reportedly. They would sing, "We ain't working nowhere." So this is the sort of rallying cry of the general strike. And they're shutting down basically all places of work as they proceed toward San Fernando, which is the largest urban center in South Trinidad, where they also shut down the power station and cut the telephone wires, basically to disrupt communications between South and the colonial government in the North. By Wednesday, this is the day after the original date of the proposed strike. The general strike has pervaded the whole island and parts of Tobago as well. So the strike spreads to harbor scheme workers, estate laborers, bus drivers, longshoremen, scavengers, lightermen, market vendors. So basically, the entire island is engaged in a general strike. So even when we talk about this as the oil strikes of 1937, really it goes much further, again, to workers in all sectors, and especially the unemployed that play this very key role as they continue to rub shoulders with their comrades who are working in these adjacent industries.
Scavengers mentioned just here are refuse collectors. So the strike was bringing together both private and public sector workers. As with many other mass strikes of this sort, which spread quite organically, the strike didn't have fixed concrete demands which were agreed in advance.
They didn't articulate specific demands during that period. But again, we can intuit from earlier circulars from Butler's Home Rule Party, from the reports of the hunger marches, and essentially they were agitating for food, for work, for other kinds of economic protection, universal wages, as well as a food depot for the unemployed. I think there was also discussion about the fact that they wanted a safe environment for market vendors to peddle their wares, that in Faisalabad Junction, essentially, it was quite unsanitary, that market vendors basically have to put, their foodstuffs on the ground. And this is something that actually upset them quite a lot. So they wanted to have the colonial government step in on a number of these measures. But I think also there's the broader question that I've been putting out here, which is about sort of their desire for dignity. And it can take the shape of all of these different proposals and policy recommendations. But principally, that's what they were in search of, right? And we saw that was shared clearly across the entire sort of Trinidad and Tobago working class at this moment because of their willingness to join in the general strike.
Also, like with other strikes of this type, even when the majority of wage workers involved were in predominantly male professions, women pretty much always play crucial roles in the disputes.
So again, women play this very prominent role in the earliest moments of the strike, which I think is important to underscore and to dispel the idea that this was simply limited to oil field workers who were almost exclusively men, and the idea that seems to persist that they were the kind of vanguard of this movement. So in general, in this period, women, and actually especially domestic servants who were working in the sort of oil field, the overseer of houses and the sort of agricultural estates, they formed a really crucial basis of the Butler movement as it grew in South Trinidad. So we see that in the reports of that time of home rule meetings leading up to the strike in 1937. We see that, of course, in the sort of iconic scene of Charlie King's death at Faisalabad Junction at the hand of this sort of mob of women Butlerites. And I think it's unfortunate that there isn't even greater archival depth to provide insight into a lot of these women, who they were, sort of what they desired out of this. But certainly the role of women in the early workers movement has actually been documented very extensively by the great, the unparalleled Rhoda Reddock, who's a professor of gender and development studies at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine. So that Her book, Women, Labor, and Politics in Trinidad and Tobago, is just an undisputed classic. And this is not limited. The scope of her book is not limited to the 1930s. So she takes a very broad view of both the activity of prominent women like Elma Francois, who I've mentioned. She also wrote a sort of a short biography of Elma Francois, but also all of these, nameless women who toiled in agricultural work, in peasant cultivation, as seamstresses, as midwives, as domestics, or as sex workers, right? So even if oil was dominated by this masculinist workforce, the strikes themselves didn't proceed exclusively on the backs of male workers. Rhoda does point out quite astutely that there is a presence of male chauvinism within the Butler movement, right? So there are women who are agitating, who want their voices to be heard. But she puts it quite bluntly that women never achieve full equality with men in sort of their organizing or sort of the platform to dictate the direction of the home rule or the Butlerite movement. And I think also here we can think about, again, the way that Butler himself enjoys this sort of charismatic masculine authority that women at the same time were not privy to. But I think what we should emphasize is that, women played a crucial role in this period, an unheralded role in some ways. It's actually betrayed by the sort of masculinist image that's adopted by latter-day trade union formation. So I think we see that, that a lot of that history is obscured behind the image of charismatic male figures like Butler.
So while the working class was in a state of revolt, what about those organizations which purported to represent the working class?
So sort of paralleling the earlier clash at the Apex oil field strike, the Labor Party and Cipriani in particular really missed the boat entirely. And I say that quite literally. Cipriani was actually on a boat in the Atlantic at the time on the return leg from the coronation at Buckingham Palace, believe it or not. So that's where he catches wind of the strike. And he immediately sends a telegram in absentia calling for restraint and self-control on the part of the strikers, basically to not engage in violence. And he says nothing of sort of supporting the strikers' demand. So I think that Cipriani really encapsulates the Labor Party position. Again, this seems to sort of follow my impressions that Cipriani is a member of the colonial legislature, again, as a distinguished guest of the crown, is much more preoccupied at this period with the preservation of order. He certainly believes in labor rights and agitation, but only through the proper channels. And of course, the proper channels inevitably mean him and his Labor Party.
So while the official left was calling for restraint and moderation, as many of our listeners will probably notice is a bit of a theme running through our episodes, British authorities responded again, as they usually did, with violence and repression.
Again, likewise, the colonial government, seeks immediately to put down the strike with the sort of full arsenal of state violence or colonial violence. We see that first, again, with the attempt to deploy police like Charlie King and others who sort of are sent from Port of Spain down to San Fernando and other sites of clash in South Trinidad. But we only see the strike sort of fully diffused with the arrival of British Marines or Blue Jackets, right? So the colonial governor, Murchison Fletcher, summons these two warships that then arrive in Trinidad. So HMS Ajax and Exeter land in Trinidad, and they are successful in essentially sort of diffusing at least that initial wave of the strike. Butler himself goes into hiding at this point. There are all these rumors about where Butler goes during this time. One of the prominent ones was that he was hiding in Venezuela, that he had sort of crossed the channel and was hiding out for a time. And he only resurfaces when he's actually summoned to give testimony to the Commission of Inquiry on the labor disturbances. So that's basically where that moment of the strike ends. But again, it demonstrates the capacity of the workers at this time. It demonstrates what they desired, and it also demonstrates what they understood their power to be.
While the strikers may not have had particular set demands, one feeling which was pretty common was the desire for home rule.
In one sense, Butler has his own designs through the Home Rule Party. And I think it is telling, and this is something that we can't fully know, the fact that workers begin the strike spontaneously, sort of ahead of the set date, perhaps suggests that they have their own understanding of what they hoped to happen. And that perhaps is what we can't know. Now, Butler, we know a lot about sort of what he wanted, what his political program was for the Home Rule Party. And I should clarify what he meant by home rule, because Butler, like many of the workers at this time, I think clearly, and it's quite explicit, understood himself to be a British subject. So his agitation for home rule, at least at this moment, seemed to be for home rule or self-government under the Union Jack, right? So really an end to crown colony rule rather than the kind of flag independence that Trinidad and Jamaica would achieve in 1962. So I actually think in this way, Butler was very prescient, right? That he understood that this was more a matter of material conditions rather than simply just the appearance of sovereignty. So he wasn't clamoring just for a flag and a national anthem. He was clamoring for distinct material conditions. And I would say not just home rule, but a kind of worker self-management, right? That he was opposed to the sort of middle management that was racially stratified. He was opposed to crown colony rule. So there is this question of what would it mean for working people in Trinidad to govern themselves at this moment? As I mentioned before, they made radical demands beyond just wage increases, the jobs guarantee, a universal wage for the unemployed, sort of public control of industries and utilities, sort of all enterprises and schemes, I think is the term that they used. So this was indeed about anti-colonialism in terms of it being an end to colonial abuse and neglect. But the material demands prevailed above all else. So they wanted land, they wanted dignified work, they wanted home rule. So this was not just about sort of the appearance of independence, which I think presages a lot of what would follow throughout the rest of the 20th century in Trinidad and throughout the sort of former British West Indies.
This was something which I didn't have a proper understanding of beforehand, as my understanding of home rule was that I thought it meant full independence from Britain. So it's very interesting to learn its more nuanced meaning to people like Butler at the time, especially given what happened across much of the British Empire, where colonialism nominally ended, only to be replaced by neo-colonialism, with a brutal extractive capitalism which left many working class and poor people in a similar situation to they were before. Despite this lack of particular demands before the strike, and despite the fact that it was ultimately suppressed by British troops, that doesn't mean that it didn't achieve concrete improvements. Indeed, this is something which occurs repeatedly in mass strikes, where groups of workers walk out one after the other and often make their own local demands and have local negotiations before returning to work.
I guess one of the things that we see emerging out of the strike is that workers do achieve very clear material gains. Particularly like the expansion of collective bargaining rights and sort of the proliferation of trade unions, including the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, which is to this day the largest sort of active trade union in Trinidad and Tobago. And that's founded by Butler and a sort of Indian barrister named Adrian Kola Rienzi. That was a name that he took on. He was born Krishna Theonarine, and actually there's a new book about Rienzi specifically by Brinsley Samaru, who again is an eminent historian at the University of the West Indies. So certainly check that out if you're interested more in the details of Rienzi's life.
In addition to improvements on the job and an improved situation for workers' rights, the rebellion had far-reaching consequences both in Trinidad and Tobago and across the region.
And I think it can be said, that the shocks and disturbances throughout the 1930s did set the sort of English-speaking Caribbean on this road to independence. After Trinidad, of course, Barbados erupts in a general strike in the same month of 1937, June 37. The following year, Jamaica follows suit in May and June of 1938. So again, this is understood to be a sort of moment of regional ferment. C.L.R. James later would say in his speech, the way he put it very poetically, he'd say, as a fire runs up a forest, it went from island to island and ended up in Jamaica, from Trinidad right up the island to Jamaica. So even as the strike ended, it served as this spark that continued to fuel agitation elsewhere and set the Caribbean on this path toward self-government and independence. I would also recommend, if anyone has a chance, to look at the interview conducted by David Scott for the Small Axe Journal with George Lamming. He talks about being a young person in this moment in Barbados and just how crucial that memory of the strike was to his sense of self, to his political consciousness. So clearly, this has all sorts of effects beyond the strike itself. Although, as I said, I think it set the British Caribbean on the road to independence, I think we could say that the course that independence took resembled more the kind of middle-class aspirations of Cipriani than the insurgent demands of Butler and his comrades, right? So this happens both because Butler is imprisoned after offering his testimony on sedition charges, and the oilfield workers trade union continues in his absence. And we watch sort of Rienzi trace much the same path that Cipriani did before him as a trade union bureaucrat.
Butler had gone into hiding after the strike, but he handed himself in September 1937. He was cleared of sedition, but convicted of incitement to riot and jailed for 2 years. But his supporters tried to keep up their activities.
At the same time, Butler writes the sort of the rank and file, the working class, and actually especially women, continue to rally in Butler's absence. So they're going, from village to village, from estate to estate, from oil field to oil field, organizing the rank and file into a sort of mass party. When Butler is released for the first time, Rienzi tries to incorporate him back into the union in this sort of ceremonial role. But Rienzi and Butler clash, much like Cipriani and Butler did years before. So again, there's a strike that breaks out at the Trinidad Lake Asphalt Company in La Brea. So this is a wildcat strike without union authorization. And Butler supports the strike. Rienzi does not support the strike. And as a result, Butler is then expelled from the union he created, from the OWTU, to start his own union. And I should say there's a really telling quote that I want to read out from Butler himself, where he says, "Men like Rienzi, Blades, Rojas, and Moses, were other sort of executive members of the OWTU, are men that you should be afraid of because they term themselves as members of the executive committee and go about fooling the people and taking away their money, telling people they have a union to support them when there are strikes and when they're out of work." So this is Butler's take on the situation. And shortly after this, Butler is actually re-imprisoned under these wartime defense regulations, and he remains in prison on Nelson Island, just offshore Trinidad, until the conclusion of World War II in 1945. So I would say that in some ways, the sort of defeat of the groundswell of the Butlerite movement came at the hands of both the wartime British Empire and the trade union leadership again. We see that sort of collaboration is what comes together to defeat the groundswell of workers.
The outbreak of World War II in 1939 was used as a justification for heavy repression across the British Empire, and a rationale for demanding patriotic loyalty, as opposed to people fighting to better their own conditions. So while improvements to conditions had been won with the struggles through the 1930s, British government policy in general was largely unchanged, and the major demands for better unemployment benefits and land redistribution went unmet.
I would say very little in terms of explicit policy change, especially with reference to the unemployed. What we see, though, again, I think are the sort of persistence of this demand of land to the people, right? So workers continue to take these matters into their own hands in the intervening decades leading up to independence.
Despite the Trinidad mass strike being a long time ago, Ryan still thinks there are important lessons workers can learn from it today.
One thing I'll say is that my commitment to telling this story is in part because I'm certainly an acolyte of CLR James. And if you go through the James archives, he's constantly referencing 1937 and Uriah Butler, but then he'll often trail off and just say, someone will have to tell that story one day. But he sees it as sort of crucial to understanding the insurgent capacity of workers in the Caribbean and of just ordinary people in general, right? So this, I think, actually, he's not in Trinidad during 1937. He's already gone up to England to, engage in his cricket reporting and his other kinds of political agitation. But I think that sort of his anti-vanguardist politics, he also finds that reflected in his birthplace. He sees that in Trinidad. He can sort of map that onto Butler and his clashes with Cipriani, who, again, James idolized as a young person. So I think that, if anything, the lessons that we can draw from this, and that James is often saying in his speeches, is that there has to be a sort of preparation for this insurgent moment, right? That rather than being a vanguard like the TLP imagined itself of sort of dictating or directing the working class, we have to be ready for when the working class does move, right? And I think this was borne out again in the summer of 2020.
Here, Ryan is of course referring to the Black Lives Matter movement, which exploded around the world following the racist police murders of George Floyd and other black people in the US.
I think a lot of us watched this happen, where the radical intelligentsia, the sort of trade union and labor bureaucracy, was completely caught off guard, because we have been told for decades now that, ordinary people don't care about revolutionary politics. They're not willing to put themselves on the line, but we see it happen time and time again. And, James gives the same speech to a group of students at Howard University in the beginning of 1970. And he's talking about the impending confrontation. They're like, what is with James? Oh, you always, he's a communist. He's always talking about the impending confrontation. And then, of course, like a week later, you see the Black Power uprising of 1970, February 1970 in Trinidad. And they run over to James. The students say, look, the confrontation is happening, So I think in some ways, this is a reminder, again, in moments where that seems to be so far from our political reality, in moments where, workers themselves are only seen to be intelligible, even to radical intellectuals, self-proclaimed radical intellectuals, as a mob. We need to be sort of both appreciate and be ready to facilitate that insurgent capacity, to not stop the strike and to lend ourselves to the strike rather than to endeavor to put it down or sort of map our own desires onto it. So that is the lesson that I would leave people with. And that's precisely this kind of legacy of Jamesian political philosophy that I hope to do justice both with this story and with the book.
In his book chapter about the strike of 1937, Ryan uses the word mob. And we at WCH use it too in quite a few of our historical stories, which you can browse on our new stories app at stories.workingclasshistory.com, link in the show notes. And this can be controversial in that some people criticize us for it and say that the word mob is a right-wing slur.
And I do think I used the word mob once, and that was to refer to the mob of women who surrounded Charlie King, right? So there's a way that I guess I've debated this quite a lot about how to use the term mob in my book manuscript and whether it's a fitting term to describe workers at the time. And, I think it also sort of fits in with debates around the crowd and crowd theory and sort of whether crowds can have political consciousness. But a mob is sort of tinged with a different tenor or disdain. So I think what I've settled on is that it's certainly accurate, right? That, as you mentioned, the colonial government, the trade union leaders, they would view the hunger marchers or the oil field workers or the Butlerites as this kind of unruly mob, that they're disorganized, they're undisciplined, they're not going through the proper channels of redress. And I choose to indulge the language of mob, not because they actually were any of these things, but I think it's more of a challenge to the so-called left today, right? What do they regard as a mere mob, in the same way as the Labor Party at the time, as, unintelligible, as an unruly multitude that actually has the capacity to represent the sort of vanguard of, insurgent labor or radical politics today. So I experimented with this a lot as I wrote this chapter. And actually, as I sifted through my archival materials, I stumbled on this quote that I had missed in sort of my earlier drafts from the Port of Spain Gazette at the time, where one of the Labor Party secretaries named Vivian Henry admonished Butler and the strikers, and I quote, for their endeavor to institute mob rule in Trinidad. So it was at that moment I realized that I had to follow through and rise to the defense of the mob.
Opponents of democracy, or even the participation of ordinary people in political life, have always warned of the dangers of mob rule. But the mob has always been an important way that we as ordinary people have been able to actually have agency and make the changes we want to see in the world. One particular example of this in the UK was during the Gordon riots of 1780. While they began as anti-Catholic riots, they quickly developed a working class and radical component. The rebels attacked the Bank of England and the notorious Newgate prison. The attack on Newgate incidentally involved a good number of black participants, including black Americans like John Glover, who told the guards, quote, "Damn you, open the gate, or we will burn you down and have everybody out," end quote. Hundreds of prisoners were freed and the prison set on fire. Rioters painted on the walls that the prisoners had been freed on the authority of, quote, His Majesty, King Mob, end quote.
And I should say here and caution here that, of course, a mob doesn't imply a specific politics, right? A mob can be reactionary too. But in this case, the language of the mob was being deployed explicitly as a counterinsurgent discourse by the labor elites and the colonial government. So, the mob is also where these nameless women are relegated to history as followers of Butler rather than a sort of source of unrelenting workers' agitation and genius unto themselves. So in a very cheeky way, I'll follow another son of Trinidad, A$AP Ferg, when I choose to ride with the mob of Butler and the working people of South Trinidad instead of the, self-appointed labor leaders and politicians. So if anything, I think we can learn from this instructive case.
Portami via, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morir, e se muoio da partigiano.
That brings us to the end of this episode about the Trinidad mass strike of 1937. As always, we've got more information, sources, and links in the webpage for this episode, link in the show notes. You can find out more about Ryan's work on his website, RyanCecilJobson.com, and give him a follow on Twitter at Ryan Cecil Jobson, links in the show notes. As a final reminder, the Working Class History podcast is only made possible because of support from you, our listeners, on Patreon. So if you can, please consider joining us for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Supporters get great benefits like ad-free episodes, exclusive early access to episodes, bonus episodes, free and discounted books and merch, and more. But we know times are hard, and if you can't spare the cash right now, don't worry about it. But if you can, please tell your friends about the podcast, share links to episodes on your social media, and maybe take a second to give us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thanks again to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jazz Hands and Jameson D. Saltzman. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.
Bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao.